Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right. Hey guys, how you doing? Welcome to the second session of the 21st Century Version of Wisdom with Gregg Henriques. Did I get it? Making it. This is the second of 4 sessions. Last week with Gregg, we talked about the theory of knowledge system, the first part of kind of how from the Big Bang to today.
Could you try again?
It looks like Peter's Siri bot wants to take over again.
I was on mute, so that wasn't me this time.
Getting more sophisticated. So today Gregg's going to present about justification systems. The format, if possible, could be the same as last time, where it's about 45 minutes, 50 minutes of lecture, and then questions. And what can really help me out with questions is if you write Q, and then write out your question. And then if you see a question you like, do +1. If you see a +1, do it +2.
I'm not sure I understand.
You can just stop talking. So if I see a +2 or +3, it's a lot easier to find what are the top voted questions. If you don't want it to, this is all going to be recorded and put on YouTube. So if you don't want to be on YouTube, just let me know. Say, hey, please read this out for me. And I'm excited. Today's session is going to be a lot of fun. So Gregg, take it away.
All right, great. Well, first off, Peter, thanks so much for having me here. Really enjoyed it last time. Peter's coming down to ToK-Society on Monday. We're looking forward to that. Actually, I should say, if anybody's interested in my work in society, I do have a theory of knowledge society. We have a pretty active listserv, and anyone can just contact me, email me, and I'll be happy to talk with you about that and put you on that if you have an interest. So yes, thank you, Anjan. Also, thank you, Peter, because you now hooked me up with Anjan. And Anjan and I have been hanging and connecting. It's been great. And also others, I look forward to talking to several of you. Contact me after this. So it's been great. So last time I sort of went through the garden and then we touched on that. And then we went through the tree of knowledge frame of reference, which is the first branch on that theory of knowledge tree behind me. And today what we're going to do is we're going to then take a tour of the second branch called Justification Systems Theory. I'm going to share my screen here in a second. Then next week, just so for folks, we're going to talk the problem of psychology and the need for a new meta-psychology. And then the last week we'll do meta-psych tech, or some version of that, meaning sort of what kind of meta-psychological coherence frame of mind do we need for the ecology of practices? What work have I done in that? And then how can we cut together? So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and dive into this, the lecture part, and then we'll have half of it for questions. So let me share my screen and we'll get to it. Okay. So today we're touring the branch 2, second branch, and in fact, where it all started actually in 1996. And on Anjan's prompting, I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. He thought that was helpful to frame. But what is this thing, justification systems theory? It's a theory of human self-consciousness and the evolution of the culture-person plane of existence. I'll talk a little bit about what exactly we mean by that, but if you recall from the tree of knowledge, matter, life, mind, and culture represent different planes of existence in that language system. So now let me tell you a little bit about justification systems theory. So the first thing I want to do is just let's orient to this thing, because the argument is this is pretty much wherever you look, that human beings are very much like fish in water, that the person culture plane of existence is everywhere around us and we see through it, but we don't always see it as much. So, let me tell a little story. So it's 1996. I'm deep in the struggling with the problem of psychology. I've learned a lot about evolutionary psychology. I've learned a lot about cognitive psychotherapy and psychology. That's what I'm doing my dissertation on. Psychotherapy, psychodynamics around psychotherapy I'm learning. And it's dawning on me that a key issue, which you'll see a little bit elaborate on here, is as the evolution of language takes off, we're then forced to give accounts. We're forced to justify our actions. And then we really become the justifying ape. And the argument is that we basically are oriented generally to justify our actions in accordance with social influence, meaning sort of the ways in which we're positioned in the social world. So we're not inclined to give explanations or accounts that really diminish us. Now, it's certainly the case that many people sometimes do seem to give accounts of themselves that seem to diminish them. And I actually was I was working in a neuropsych rehab when this idea really popped. I mean, I had been playing around with it, but it was with this, and then I had to fill in. Somebody went on vacation, it was over the holiday, and I was then in the psychiatric domain. And then I did an eval on a woman who came in and just made a suicide attempt. Her father had died 6 months earlier. I don't remember exactly the cause. She was about late 20s, mid 30s. She lived by herself in borderline poverty, very much isolated. Her narrative is a narrative you see in the clinical world fairly regularly, unfortunately. She lived in rural Vermont, grew up in rural Vermont, and her father was a raging alcoholic who dominated a submissive, timid mother. And she had an older brother. Now, one of the striking things about this woman was how she totally saw herself as inadequate, ineffective, really hated herself. And although, for example, her IQ, if memory serves, was somewhere in the 110 ballpark, she thought herself as stupid. I think objectively, most people who found her as relatively attractive. She thought herself as ugly. Essentially, she was downgrading herself on every indicator. Now, if you are oriented to justify yourself in a particular way, why on earth would somebody downrate themselves? And yet we do see it in a subset of population, a subset of people. Well, here's the dynamic where the exception proves the rule. So when she was growing up, her older brother, is 4 or 5 years older, started becoming defiant of her alcoholic father. And as an adolescent, he started to rebel, and they got into physical fights, and he would be physically beaten by his father. And she remembered a specific incident where her father was beating her brother. And he said to her, he said, "Why can't you be more like your obedient sister?" And that stuck in her head. She told me that story. Okay. Well, as she relayed the story, and I was thinking, my frame was, oh my gosh, our self-concept pertains to the way we justify ourselves on the social stage, these social influence dynamics. Something really clicked where the exception proves the rule here. Think about it. So she's 8. Her father experiences defiance from a 12-year-old boy who's going to be a lot stronger than she is, and he kicks the boy's ass. What's going to happen if she asserts that she's a valuable person, that she's smart, that she warrants power, that he's treating her unfairly? What happens is that, well, very likely, the calculus would be you're going to be beaten. You're going to have your physical safety put at obvious risk. So what happens then is if you turn against the self and you say, I'm actually not worthy, what that justifies then is submission and deference. It's basically a white flag. And if you look at the animal kingdom, you see white flags all the time. Okay? And so here we had a self-concept system that turned against itself. But if we understood the adaptive history, we see that submission and deference was essentially demanded by her authoritarian, abusive father. And all of a sudden, the exception plays the rule. Now, the narrative I tell on this is that this clicks on me, and I'm up and, I'm really excited. And I start chatting with my fellow doctoral students. I was a doctoral student at the University of Vermont at the time. And I'm explaining, oh my gosh, this idea of justification, I now can figure out, at least with this case, how the exception proves the rule. And maybe we really are justifying, and I can start to see this in my clients. And, and it turns out that I look up at the clock and it's 6:20. Now, my wife was waiting for me, and this is, of course, before the days of cell phones, the mid-1990s here. And I'm like, oh, God, I'm supposed to be home at 6. Right? So I say, all right, I got to go. Head out into my car, get in my car. We only live about 5 minutes away. We live in a little town called Winooski, which is near Burlington. I get in my car, and 2 seconds after I get out, all of a sudden they're doing road work. And what should have taken me 5 minutes to get home takes me 15 minutes to get home. So I walk in the door at 6:35, and I've been late earlier, a week earlier, And, you know, you don't want to keep your spouse half an hour waiting. So she's sitting there pissed. And it's like, where have you been? And without 2 seconds worth of thought, I look and say, it's the traffic. They're doing, can you believe it? They're doing traffic. Okay. And that's why I'm late. I didn't have to think about that. They didn't take any delay. There it is. Okay. Now, if we then back up and we look at actually what happened, 20 minutes of the reason I was late was because I was paid attention to myself, obsessed with my theory, wanted to be discussing that. Okay. 10 minutes was because I was traffic, right? It was because of the traffic. It didn't take my mind any effort to pull out the traffic reason and hand us that. That wasn't self-conscious. It was an automatic. Another story I tell about this is when I was watching in a different context, watching my 4-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son, and they were playing initially, and then they got into it a bit, and I was just watching them. My son hit my daughter a little bit, and then she pushed him down, knocked him down, okay? He starts crying. I assure him on my machine and said, hey, what happened here? My 4-year-old looks at me, and he fell, okay? Notice that it explains why he's on the ground and crying, but it subtracts some key elements of the information. A justification filter. All of a sudden, you're given accounts. Okay, so if we situate ourselves in this, what you see here is what I'm going to invite you to think, that justification dynamics and the way in which we explain ourselves are absolutely ubiquitous. I'm going to also, I find a lot of mileage when I'm doing clinical work. As we start to get into people, I invite them to think about their justification narrative. If they're telling me an event about what happened or who they are or what they get into it, I'll often refer to it. It sounds like your justification narrative is this. In fact, narrative psychology and psychotherapy is a big deal. I add the word justification because you can then, once you do that, you see the structural and functional organization. You see that actually you're trying to legitimize what is and ought in relation. I'm going to be arguing it's the essence of persons behaving in culture. Okay? There's a psychologist by the name of Peter Osario who argues that the definition of a person, which actually is different than a human being, a definition of a person is an entity that can self-consciously justify themselves on the social stage and take account and responsibility for why they do what they do. And finally, we're going to talk about it also as this network of propositional knowing. A network of propositional knowing. So this is a ubiquitous concept. And when you learn to see the world through the lens of justification, you see it everywhere, like right here. Like I am justifying to you that justification systems theory is a good way to think about the world. Okay, so to now position ourselves, I'm going to locate just in the context of the unified theory, where since we're all fans of John Vervaeke, or at least I project that out into the world. We're going to make a connection to his work in a theory of propositional knowing. We're then going to go back in time and identify the problem of justification, how it would have emerged in the course of the evolution of language, and then how that sets up a thing called the updated tripartite model, which is a model of human consciousness. And then finally, we're going to talk briefly about the culture-person plane of existence, and we'll allude to the brilliant work of Peter Limberg and talk to about Culture War 2.0 and the current state of our justification systems and their fragmented pluralism as we go through this time between worlds. Okay, so we want to locate this thing in this overarching system. So the unified theory of knowledge tree identifies 8 key ideas around knowledge, justification, investment, influence, adaptation, development, well-being, and mindfulness. Its core is fundamentally wisdom. So now let's locate it in this particular domain. We have, last time we covered the tree of knowledge system, which orients us to the first branch. And justification systems theory is the joint point between mind and culture on the tree. And it sets the stage then to give us an updated tripartite model of human consciousness and the evolution of the culture-person plane of existence. In fact, that's what this depicts right here, is the joint point between mind and culture on the ToK, a theory of culture that includes the evolution of human knowing, including science. That actually becomes a big deal later on. Not necessarily in this talk, but in other contexts. It offers what's called a reverse engineering hypothesis about the evolution of human reason giving and the evolution of our propositional knowledge system. And then let's move into the domains of human consciousness that this maps, okay? So I'm going to argue that it offers us a useful way to understand human consciousness. We can now get situated. So if we take a second here, I'm going to identify three broad domains. One is the experiential self. This also, another word for this is phenomenology. This is the thing that goes offline when you fall asleep, and when you come online, it integrates your senses and gives you your point of view in the world, your first person perspective behind your eyes, between your ears, that no one else can get direct access to. Then have a private self, that's a narrator, and a public self, which you can then record on. I'm going to introduce another vocabulary that will overlap some with this, and that is, there's a thing called Mind 1A. Okay, this is a model of consciousness, and I want to differentiate it from a model of neurocognition, although these two domains need to be, to make the clear, some of you may know of Steven Pinker's work. This was an influential book in my day, 1997, I think it was published. Steven Pinker articulates how the mind works. This is a theory, Steven Pinker's work is a theory of what I would call Mind 1A. In other words, in fact, he says it's not a theory of sentience, and it's not a good theory of self-consciousness either. It's a neurocomputational functional analysis, okay, from an evolutionary perspective about how the nervous system as an information processing system computes behavior. Overt behavior in my language is called Mind 1B because it's mediated through neuromuscular and can be seen from the outside. But relevant for us are the two other domains of mind, one of which is Mind 2. So when I use the word Mind 2 in some other kind of settings, or if I use the experiential sentience, Mind 2 refers to phenomenology, first person experience of being. Then we have Mind 3A, the interior narrative, and Mind 3B, the exterior narrative. The reason I believe that this is really crucial is because, according from my vantage point, we're enormously confused in our understanding of how to talk about the mind in general, its relationship to consciousness, its relationship to self-consciousness. In fact, as I will talk about next time, the problem of psychology is very much the fact that we lack a conceptual grammar that allows us to effectively talk about mind and behavior. And what the Mind 1, 2, 3 map does is it tells you actually how to sort out that and give rise to a much more clarifying vocabulary. For our purposes, justification systems theory is about Mind 3, its emergence, its form, its structure. So let's just touch briefly on John Vervaeke's 4 P's of cognition. There's John talking about them and on rebel wisdom. And lost ways of knowing also includes Greg Thomas. It's a great half-hour presentation there. And John's 4 P's of knowing start with procedural knowing. This is the most basic forms of knowing. It connects kind of insights. Now, certainly you can get very, very complicated forms of procedural knowing, but most obviously our procedural knowing gets then dropped into our habits, becomes fairly automatic, and is generally the least conscious forms that John talks about. Perspectival knowing refers to point of view integration, senses into a perceptual whole. It's connected to the screen, the global neuronal workspace of subjective experience, if you want to throw a Bernie Bars reference in there. John also talks about participatory knowing, which really is when you start to engage your perspective in regards to the whole animal arena environment, and then you're engaged in a particular kind of novel task that isn't reducible to procedures that you have already learned but are new. So when you're first driving, you're engaged in a lot of participatory driving, and then you can reduce a lot of that to procedural knowledge, okay? And then finally, there's propositional knowing, which is language-based knowledge, reasoning, and reason giving. I often point out that us as human beings are both primates and we are persons. And we can very much align these 3 domains of knowing, the first 3 P's, with our primate. In other words, we share procedural, perspectival, and participatory knowing with the primate kingdom. In fact, we share it with lots of the animal kingdom. Yet the advanced symbolic, syntactical, propositional knowing, well, that's what makes us human beings quite unique because it enables us to become fully functioning persons. So, justification systems theory provides an evolutionary framework for propositional knowing, and then how it shapes human self-consciousness and culture. It enables us to understand a reverse engineering lock and key formulation that gives rise to this map, updated tripartite model, and helps explains the processes that give rise to the evolution of culture across the last several tens of thousands of years. It is something too that needs to be explained, because if we look at the archaeological record, we see over the last 75 to 50,000 years, basically a human mind big bang, where we see the evolution of culture transforming how humans interact with the environment. Of course, the archaeological record is the technological material culture of things that are left behind, but there's a huge amount of evidence that suggests that this thing has exploded over the last 50,000 years. Just posits that humans have an elaborate self-consciousness system because the evolution of language creates a thing called the problem of justification. And I want to highlight exactly what that is. But the bottom line answer is, because of language, humans become the only animal that has to explain why it does what it does. First, there are actions and motives and feelings, and then with language, self-conscious reasoning must emerge. I also want to be very clear here that the rest of the animal kingdom is very rich in both its mental life and its communication capacities. But there's a big difference between communicating why you have to do what you did or why you did what you did, as opposed to engaging in all sorts of other kinds of communications. Just hang out with your dog sometime and try to get it to give you a reason why it did what it did. You can hang out with your dog in an unbelievably rich participatory way, but getting your dog to explain why it did what it did is a totally different problem. In fact, my friend Joe Mikulski had an opportunity to have lunch or a special dinner, can't remember exactly, with Jane Goodall, and he's very familiar with this. He asked her, you know, do chimps, as far as you're aware, ever justify their actions? And her answer was resounding no. They have very, very many advanced mental abilities, but no, they don't necessarily do that. So there are three basic postulates to this justification systems theory. The first is the evolution of propositional language must have created the adaptive problem of justification, which, and I won't get into it too much, actually breaks down into three different related problems, one of which is the analytic problem, another is the personal problem, and a third is the social problem of justification. That is the adaptive dynamic problem. The consequence is the human self-consciousness system functions as a justification, and that gives rise to specifiable dynamic relations with the subjective self, and I should say here, the interpersonal world. That means this is the design features that then match to the adaptive problem, and you will see this with the shape and structure and domains and functional relations that we see with consciousness. Finally, just provides a frame for understanding the rapid evolution of human culture over the past year and the nature, structure, function of the culture, person, plane of existence. That's the three postulates they weave together. So postulate one, human language resulted in the emergence of the adaptive problem. So we can start here with wherever language emerges, and we can argue that initially what you get is you have shared intentionality, cooperation around big, difficult items. Certainly for a long period of time, humans are engaged in intense social cooperation. This is long before symbolic language, at least certainly in this model, would have taken off. And you can have gesturing, you can have mimetic communication, meaning we'll match each other, we'll have all sorts of different kind of shared attention. And then what will happen then is that shared attentional space then gives rise for the symbolic tagging. Symbolic tagging, which will then capture various objects, various activities. You say things like antelope there or kill. These will capture various elements. However, okay, although this is important, this is not exactly the tipping point that leads to the Big Bang from this perspective in transition. What happens is when there's a development of arrangement of a symbolic syntactical structure that leads to propositions such as, there is the mammoth, let's start the hunt. Notice these are propositional claims. All of a sudden, a propositional claim activates a totally another kind of response that says, why should we? We might get killed, okay? When we say just kill, that's not to say that there would be no way to negotiate a kill, but you cannot negotiate whether a command to kill with the dynamic of justification without a propositional set of claims. Once you have propositional claims, then all of a sudden you get what's called question, answer, dynamics, and dialogues, okay? Why? Because a propositional claim sets the stage for a truth claim. That's what the propositional is in definition, which then in turn gives rise to the potential for a counterfactual, i.e. maybe that's wrong, okay? And now what that does is that then allows for the cognitive gadget of a question that then poses the opportunity that maybe the negative, a guy by the name of Roy Bashkar expands his critical realism into dialectical critical realism, because he expands from, oh, this is what is, wait a minute, what is the negative space? We always need to create negative space contingency considerations. Well, actually, a proposition sets the stage for negative space contingency, and we see that all the time in the capacity for questions. Questions then raise why, what, where, how. What do you mean you now get to fill in or question or challenge? It's the question-answer dynamics that fundamentally in this model is the tipping feedback loop that sets the stage for general justification. And this gives rise to the problem of justification in general, which is determining what is and what the group ought to do. And this sets the stage for general reasoning in a social context, okay? And ultimately, this is going to create a feedback loop where individuals are engaged in the process of the construction of systems of justification, okay? So reason giving tied to outcomes give rise to tradition and practices. And indeed, the argument here is that these systems of justification in the last 40, 50, 30, 20,000 years then set the stage for animistic belief value systems, oral narrative traditions, okay, that then set the stage for individual wise elders who could understand the narrative history of their particular tribe across the generations and bring explicating sense-making systems so that you can then interpret debates, interpret the nature of the animistic gods and spirits, one's place in nature, how to negotiate between various conflicts. And we ultimately then see the first deep cultural meaning-making systems in the oral indigenous tradition. And this is what is meant by culture with a capital C in the tree of knowledge and unified theory. A recent book by Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber delineates how dialogue gave rise to argumentation and justification. In fact, they come up with a strikingly parallel theory, the one I developed 15 years prior to its publication. So now I want to, but the justification hypothesis into systems theory goes much further than just the idea that the problem of justification is argumentation and dialogue. I'm a clinician. And so I'm deeply focused on the process by which people narrate to themselves and others and how that relates to various elements of their psyche, okay? And how it would relate to how they might construct a narrative of self and where, for example, the shadow comes from. Why do people have such radically different approaches and narratives? Like if you talk to a husband and wife in conflict, why do they have such unbelievably different versions of reality? Why do, if you watch a football game on one side, you think the refs are unbelievably lame against you, and then the other side also thinks the refs lame, only on the exact opposite way, cheating your team? Why are people like that? What is the filter on that? Well, it has a lot to do with the problem of the personal into social dynamics of justification. So here we have an imaginary situation where we have alpha male who comes around and notice is that somebody's hanging around with his pair-bonded significant other. And so we can imagine that beta is attracted to alpha's mate, and alpha wants to know why he's spending time with her. Why are you hanging around with my pair-bonded other? Okay, now this creates a very tricky dynamic, okay? And by the way, this is gonna now set up, all right, one of our big dynamics that we need to learn at the cultural person plane, which is how do you give an account for your behavior? We go back to my 4-year-old daughter. Her initial account of why her 2-year-old brother was sitting on the ground crying was he fell, okay? But then I say, well, actually, it's more complicated than that, right? Okay? So now somebody else can give a frame of reference in relationship to that based on evidence and then hold you accountable. So how do you tell the story of who you are and what is real in an analytic sense, but at the same time manage all the complicated social dynamics? So this problem of justification then sets the stage so that according to it, language is a window into the mind. As such, while there's much that we want to share freely, when our interests don't align, like with alpha and beta, okay, what we do and how we share our thoughts is crucial, and it's tied to an absolutely essential resource, social influence. This is the capacity to move other people in accordance with our interests, all right? If this is true, then the self-consciousness system should have been shaped to construct information about the self and the world in a way that solves the problem of personal social. If so, we should see evidence for this, okay? So this gets us to the second postulate, that the shape, design, functionality of the self-consciousness system should be operating as a mental organism of justification that navigates the social influence dynamics. And it's going to bring us to the central insights of this guy, who you probably know. Okay, now let's return to alpha and beta. Okay, and we are now faced with this question of now all of a sudden having to be given an account. And let's imagine beta says, hey, I hope to separate the two of you and take her as my mate. After all, this is an accurate translation of his underlying drive and desire. Now, let's think about that for a second and think about the problem of social influence. Can we imagine that this might be a problem if he accounted for his behavior this way? Well, it's so apparently obvious to us. This is the lens that we see through. What I would like to pose to you is that you are constantly and exquisitely attuned to your reason giving in the social influence. And when we see somebody say something like this, you say, well, has that guy got a problem? Not to be pejorative, but immediately if somebody would make these kinds of comments from a clinical perspective, I'd be like, oh, does this person have a little bit of autism? Okay. Autism has actually got some mind blindness, at least according to Simon Baron-Cohen, which means it's very hard to detect the social dynamics that are associated with it. So you are not attuned to these kinds of things, and you find yourself saying unbelievably blunt things that sound tone deaf and get you in trouble. Okay. So what does he generally say? Hey man, no problem. She's teaching me to plant seeds. Okay. Now, what is this? This could be a lie, but I'm going to propose that it's something not so much a lie here. Okay. We're going to come back to this, but we also now, because immediately need to say, well, if we are in this kind of situation, now alpha's got to decide whether or not this justification is legitimate or whether it hides something, and he's BSing. All of a sudden now we're going to get into the problem of BS, which is unbelievably central to social world and complication. I know John talks a lot about it. But the idea here is that we're not just talking about the evolution of lying and deceit, although obviously the distinction between private thought and public thought brings to rise that filter and filtering dynamics between them. But I'm more after the subtle dynamic, okay? Which is, this is how do we fundamentally frame ourselves? And the argument here is before he is ever in question, beta must deal with the possibility of being questioned. That is, we walk around with the idea that we're about ready to be given an account. In fact, I deal with people all the time in the clinic room who are hyper self-conscious, essentially chronically imagining account giving where they might be punished or criticized and then trying to preempt that with narrative about why they're okay or why they better not act in a way that affords that. So the argument is not that he's prepping a lie. The argument is that he is finding a path of narrative, of activity, of other things that allow him to create a narrative that's consistent in accordance with social influence. And although his underlying desire may well be to get close to her so that ultimately he has an opportunity for that kind of connection, the I am trying to have her as a mate is repressed outside of awareness. Okay? In other words, the dangerous impulses now are taken outside of what's socially acceptable and put into the shadow side of the subconscious portion of the psyche. And as soon as we say that, we're like, oh my gosh, where are we now? We are on Freud's tripartite model. Okay? So Freud, of course, fundamental observation over the years once he first discovers the unconscious and then develops a model for the various domains of structural function relations in the three persona of the id, the underlying animalistic impulse that wants something for its own pleasure, versus the ego, which is then going to operate on a reality-based principle that costs time, and then in conflict with an internalized standard from what's the socially acceptable rationale from the idealized parent that then tells you what you need to do in order to get what? Social acceptance in a societal frame that has certain values and rules. Okay, so the superego then is that internalized punish yourself first so that you internalize the standards. So fundamentally, we're talking about an analytic self-centered urge and an internalized standard that a self-consciousness system now needs to regulate in reality. So here's the model also. This time it also has the topographical features and relationship to the structural features in regards to it. So what we're going to now see is that the updated tripartite model has lots of indebtedness to Freud, but it also updates it in relationship to modern science, and it clarifies the topographical and structural functional dynamic relations and places them on an evolutionary foundation. And it's going to make them consistent with social cognitive psychology, and it's going to make it consistent with sociocultural principles. So the domains are the experiential system, the private self-consciousness system, and the public self-consciousness system. It also then corresponds to mind 2, mind 3A, and mind 3B. The mind 2, nonverbal, is the perceptual emotional core of the self. It's the first person view on the world. Okay. These are your perceptions, your basic drives, motives, emotionally organized, pleasure and pain. We can dialogue a lot about the layering. In fact, this is what I'm doing a lot with John Vervaeke in Untangling the World Knot, is delineating the perspectival and participatory aspects of mind 2, how it emerges out of mind 1, meaning the neurocognitive functionalist processes that then become conscious. What are the elements, the metaphysical elements, and the functional elements, and the evolutionary elements of that. And we should note that for Freud, when Freud uses the term consciousness, that's why I meant to say that in the topographical element, when Freud uses the word consciousness, he actually means what I mean by self-conscious, okay? That is the explicit reason-giving understanding. So if something is not explicitly reasoning, so Freud does not differentiate between perspectival, perceptual consciousness and self-conscious narration. He just uses the term consciousness, which, by the way, is why that topographical model is not ideal. I'm happy to take questions. We can talk about what's called the experiential self, how this connects into what's called episodic memory, and how this self then extends through time, how animals, as you get more and more sophisticated, you will develop an intuitive, implicit experience of self. One's perspective, animals will demonstrate, even things like ravens will demonstrate that they have access to that they know things that other individuals don't know. It's really, really interesting. So I can talk about the development of the experiential self, which is different a little bit than the experiential screen of consciousness, although they are definitely connected. We can certainly state that the experience of red is fundamentally different than the thought and reflective narration about what redness is. And this gives us rise to the private self-consciousness system, which is the seat of our self-reflective awareness, our narrative stream of conscious justification. It then stores our explicit our semantic knowledge of self, as well as then that will tie in with our episodic memories to give rise to narrative of self, our sense of self-concept, our ideology, morality, and worldview, what we believe to be true about the world, and is often interpreted as ego, interpreter, narrator. I'll use the term interpreter sometimes. That's a nod to Michael Gazzaniga and the work he did with split brain, which is an unbelievable demonstration that if you isolate the left hemisphere from knowledge of what's going on, say in the right hemisphere, it will simply confabulate socially acceptable rationale for why you're doing what you're doing in a direct alignment with justification systems theory. But the idea of thinking something is quite different than the idea of saying something. So we might come across this individual with some funky sweater on, and we might think to ourselves, hey, I don't like that shirt. It doesn't look good on her. But if you say that publicly, that comes with a wide variety of different implications. Okay? And we engage all the time with public-private filtering. I'll give you another little anecdote. I'm on many, many different listservs. About 4 years ago, I was on a listserv. I was in sort of a dispute with a guy I felt was really obnoxious. And so one of my friend back-channeled and said, hey, what's that guy's problem? And I said, oh, this guy's got problems. He's kind of really annoying. He always does this. Hit send, and guess what I had replied to? The entire list of 250 people. All right. And immediately I jolted out a jolt of pain and reached toward the computer as if I could pull that sent email back out from the ether. Okay. Why? What happened there is, well, privately, I could say one thing about this guy. I didn't want to say it to 250 people. That's a private public filtration. So what do we normally say when we come across these things? We white lie it and say it looks nice. Why? Because in terms of social influence dynamics, okay, this is a lot easier. So the public self-consciousness system is what we publicly share and proclaim ourselves to be. It's our persona, the image we try to project, largely defined by audience. You know, note, I'm a guy that emphasizes integrity. I'm a guy that emphasizes consistency. But believe me, if I'm talking to person A and they're having a conflict with person B. I'm narrating with person A, and boom, I'm totally different in many ways than I'm talking with person B. I mean, what I emphasize, what's justified, what I think about, all of that stuff is framed by who it is that the audience is. Pay attention to yourself, you'll see that, okay? It's operating always when we lie, deceive, or manipulate others from true intent, okay? And it's gonna relate deeply to our felt sense of our place in the relational matrix, okay? So now there are these three domains: experiential, private, and public. That's really important to delineate, but even more important to get theoretically sophisticated around is to identify the dynamic in a relation. Okay? The first is the attentional filter. This is between mind one, the unconscious domain of neuroinformation processing, and then how does it become? We could talk about exactly that. Again, that's a John VERVAEKE and I primary problem. So how does the attentional filter actually give rise to something that's consciously experienced at the perspectival level? There's the experiential into Freudian filter. This refers to the dynamic attention as you start to become aware of it. How do you narrate it? And then how does your top-down attentional shift begin to shift based on what you want to pay attention to, what you don't? And then finally, the private to public. Hey, do I want to tell this person? How do I want to come across? What do people think? Am I going to be an imposter whereby my persona really is what other people see and it hides my true self? These are all dynamic relational interfaces between these different domains of the human consciousness system. So that attentional filter depends on what we become aware of, both in perceptual awareness and depending on how we narrate it, there'll be an iterative feedback loop. That Freudian filter fundamentally involves the way we keep the private self, works to keep stuff off the stage of consciousness. I like to tell a story of one of my friends when we were growing up. Of course, when I was hanging out, and most of us were heterosexual when we were 15, 16. Oh my gosh, look at all the hot girls. He was always lukewarm, okay, in relationship to this. And then in college, ultimately, he comes out of the closet, okay? So what do we mean by that? It means when he was 14, 15, he wasn't having the same feelings. He was basically playing along. Back in the 80s, being gay was a little bit different than being today. We were more judgmental, less enlightened during those times. His father was a bit homophobic. So he kept himself in the closet. It means that underlying his experiential self, as that started to come onto the stage, his homosexual desires, the justification and public image stuff was so powerful, it would cut it off. He would shift, he would repress those desires until finally he got to a place where it was obvious enough and safe enough and long-standing enough. So he first came out to himself, that's through the Freudian filter, into the private narrator, and then ultimately came out to others. Ultimately coming out of the closet is through the private self and into the public, okay? All of this then relates to Freud's fundamental observation that there's a fundamental tension between that ego self-conscious system, what is expected of itself, and the underlying drives, images, and impulses. Okay. And then we have what we show and hide to others. It's called the Rogerian because the difference between one's social self and authentic self is emphasized by Rogers. When someone really hears you without passing judgment on you, without trying to take responsibility for you, without trying to mold you, feels damn good. This is actually when you're seen, known, and valued through and through, and you don't have to filter and justify. When you're held, and yes, if you're gay, we still love you, or whatever it is that you then feel reflected back into your organismic valuing process, and you're valued for that. I've talked about that. Known and valued through and through. That's an unbelievably nurturing thing in the humanists capture. Okay? And finally, just provides a way to understand the evolution of human culture on the person-culture plane of existence. That's this on the tree of knowledge. We can jump right up here and basically like, well, wait a minute. Okay, what do we mean by that? Well, if we take Peter Lindbergh's argument around what are these mimetic tribes and why all of a sudden what's happening, I would argue what's happening is the paradigmatic frame of justification that was operating in modernity is breaking down. Our sense-making, narrating, authority structures are no longer able to hold together with clarity to socialize us so that we all have some shared sense of identity. In fact, everything is losing its authority. The postmodern critique, the craziness of the digital, the craziness of the wars create a massive flux in our paradigmatic understanding. And so what's happening is a breakdown in that, and then all these different tribes, these paradigms of justification. What they do in this article, which is so excellent, is they then it comes with a whole deconstruction of what, 25 or 32 little tribes with their core justification. They have their iconic person, their core principles, and then they define themselves against what are they fundamentally against So you then have what is and what ought to be. Who do you want to follow? What's the social influence? Who are the threats? How are we trying to gain influence? And what's the fundamental narrative? So it's an excellent delineation of cultural paradigms, which really are systems of justification. You can see that by how they define what is and ought to be, and how they get then defined against other systems which define what is and ought to be. And it allows us to see at the macro cultural level, we're in a serious flux right now because we don't have good systems of justification actually help us make sense, engage in sense making. Why all of a sudden are these emerging cultures asking the question, how actually do we make sense? How do we gain a system of justification that we can communicate and have some degree of coherence, consilience, and whatnot? And finally, I'll end with some sort of notion about where we are in the evolution of cultural justification. I'm going to argue, and I've suggested this, that initially what you get is oral indigenous justification, as narrative in the hunter-gatherer Dunbar tribe. You get individuals embedded in nature, seeing animist experience face-to-face across a long period of time. That's actually what we're prepared for. And as long as we work together, you actually be known and valued in that kind of scenario. And I believe the oral indigenous context is really is going to be much better for our soul in many ways. We then get civilized at about 10,000 years ago, and certainly by 5,000 years ago, we see writing, massive civilizations. You cannot engage in oral indigenous. You have much more formal systems for a whole host of different reasons. So you get formal priest, formal argument, you get writing, you get much more complex and abstract analytic things. You need laws and national identities and clear hierarchies that legitimize a particular national, religious, philosophical way of being. So now you have a much more abstract, formal system of justification. We see 500 years ago, we get the emergence of modern science, and then the sort of global, at least coming off the West, sort of this global capitalistic scientific way of thinking. And in the last 50 years, we see a postmodern critique, okay? And I think this is a very nice shorthand. Rachel Anderson does a wonderful job of framing the kind of sensibility that we need here, one that recognizes each of these four and then cultivates one that includes and transcends to create a cultural consciousness that actually embraces the essence of the best of an oral indigenous. What is a formal, civilized, legal, pre-modern identity? What's modern science? What's the postmodern critique of that? And can we cultivate a system of justification? That's the meta-modern identity, according to Rachel Anderson, and I agree very much with it. So ultimately, just as a theory of propositional knowing, it identifies three key domains: experiential, private, public, in relationship to the updated tripartite model. And these are connected by three filters, and it sets the stage: the evolution of culture and the nature of the person, culture-person plane of existence. And in particular, where are we? What kind of justification system attitude do we need in the 21st century if we are actually going to cultivate a vision of wisdom? Thank you.
Quite the whirlwind. Thanks, Greg. I want to just kind of see if I'm understanding how to place this, and if I'm understanding kind of the, the explain it like I'm five version of it.
Sure.
Last week you talked about like the relationship between all these different domains. You can actually understand them in a united way, and that helps you see that a human could be understood at the matter level, at the life level. There's evolutionary forces at the mind level, the different behavioral aspects of what it means to be human. It's a lot easier to eat Doritos when it's on your countertop versus if it's in your cupboard. And then if I'm understanding this correctly, it's the next level, the culture. You're making the argument that that leap from mind to culture, it was language, but specifically propositional forms of justification that define that leap. And since we're so much a cultural creature today, you can most understand the basis for the way we think about stuff by understanding this justification hypothesis.
That's a very good way of saying it. Let me be, sometimes language is easy to get confused around because there's lots of different meanings. It's capital C, culture, person. Okay, I want to yoke that stuff together and be clear. And the reason is people will often point out and say, wait a minute, animals have culture. Okay. And they'll point out that different animals engage in different practices. Monkeys will wash potatoes. They'll learn how to wash potatoes. They'll transfer those practices. There's a wonderful book by Carl Safina called Beyond Words. I wish it was called Before Words, but nonetheless, it tracks the very different cultures of things like elephants, the killer whales, wolves, okay? So let me first state that little c culture, or the shared set of sort of communal values and practices, you can see these in other higher animals very clearly, okay? And if you mean by culture just the shared sense of community and practice, and that gives a unique flavor to something that does have an intergenerational learning tradition, then I want to be clear that that's an overgeneralized meaning of the word. Human culture and the culture person plane of existence is absolutely transformed and defined by this thing we call language, in particular propositional language, and the networks of propositions that then yoke together to create these systems of justification. So that's a very important difference. And so little c culture at the animal level does exist, but then you get into big capital C culture and the nature of persons. No other animal other than a human being is a person from this perspective. And then that is the problem of then full explicit intersubjective self-consciousness, then the idea of what is justifiably good, and then how do you and bad, and then how do you count yourself? Yes, that's absolutely key. And then that lens allows us to see the way in which we are both persons as we operate in culture, and also are primates, because we do all the other things that primates do, like eat Doritos, sleep, and have sex, you know.
Is the implication from this then kind of like, in economics, we model, oh, people are these rational beings, and anybody in the world's like, no, we're not. We're all crazy and irrational, and we rationalize things and have all these beliefs. So kind of, is the takeaway or implication from this that like the best way to understand a human is not this rational reasoning being, but it is consciousness, and that reasoning evolved for justification? Like, that's why going to somebody and explaining 50 facts about climate change doesn't necessarily change their mind. Could you like help?
Sure. So a couple of things there. So first, let me say that the word, we split off analytic truth, and this is one of the problems of philosophy. They split off analytic truth claims, 2 + 2 = 4, okay? A priori truth claims, these are absolute. And then there's this rationalization dynamic where people bullshit to hide underlying reasons, and they lie and they do all that stuff. That's what social people do. What we're really after is analytic truth claims, okay? Nice thing about the word justification is it actually shows that as a dimension, okay? So Einstein comes up with E = mc². In my system, that's an analytic justification, okay? If he was late to his wife coming home and said, hey, you know, the traffic, well, that's also a justification. It's a rationalization, okay? Justification then gives you the lens to see the dimension all the way from analytic claims, okay, to, hey, let's go to the movies claim, to a defensive claim, to a lie. In fact, I did the context of justification anywhere from a con game to a defense attorney and courtroom, to the courtyard, to the lab. All right. So the first thing I would say is, yeah, be aware that we actually now, with this concept, we actually now create the dimension, okay, of propositional knowing. And philosophy tends to, and we get taught, oh, well, there's truth claims and then there's bullshit. It's like, well, actually, this is the first thing you want to do is create this category, and then you want to divide it up secondarily, okay? So then the other thing is, absolutely, you will both want to see the ways in which we are unbelievably shaped, okay? Anybody that speaks to the socialization of knowledge, of our development, if you adopt a social constructionist view of the importance of knowledge, you will then say, oh my God, it's unbelievably important that I was born into, you know, I was born in North America, Northern Virginia. I have 2 white parents who are highly educated. Well, that tells a lot about me. If I were born 30,000 years ago, okay, or even 30 years ago in Saudi Arabia, the cultural systems of justification and my whole sense-making system would be radically different. So the power of these narratives, historical context, in shaping what we do and what we believe and why we do them is enormous. At the same time, we're all primates, okay? So then this gets into, well, what is it about our human nature? Certainly one of my big struggles, actually, this was an intersection where I'm learning what's the evolution of human nature relative to the power of cultural construction, okay? And the answer is, well, it depends on what lens you look at it. from one level, it's like, it's not that powerful at all. We're primates, we're going to reach for the Doritos 90%. You can nudge people in certain ways. Yeah, they rationalize, but that's all post hoc. It's all brain-based here and now, reward dopamine. The whole context is context of justification. The reason you're doing the lab is actually because of the way you justified. So believe me, it's unbelievably important. The question is how, okay? So what is the intersection between the cultural constructive systems and the upload of nature and that intersection? This provides that frame of mind. So
I'm curious. I'm curious in some like ways, day to day or week to week, this framework helps you understand stuff, be it what you see on TV or seeing people argue about something in a shopping mall. Like, could you share some examples of?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, first off, that's how I see verbal comment. I started much like Mercer and Sperber. Okay. So it's so deep in me that it's been so transformative. When I initially landed on this, I was trained as an experimental social cognitive psychologist, and I was then going to do research. I was starting to do the process of like, okay, what are the predictions that it makes so I can take this into the lab and see if this thing actually works, okay? Well, as I started to do that, guess what I realized I was doing? I realized I was building a justification system that then tested and blah, 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 okay? And ultimately what then happens is, although you can certainly do that, it does make very clear predictions. I think the predictions are unbelievably, and there's a lot of interesting things to engage in, but ultimately what happens is it becomes a description, okay? It becomes a description of what you are doing, and as you are engaged in, so just watch, all right? So now I can't watch like a political debate, right? Obviously, I'm sure all of you have this problem, okay? But basically, what are you doing? You are essentially defending your team. That's the whole damn goal, all right? So you're completely motivated to defend your team and do whatever you can to justify social influence for your team. That's why you never answer the question in a truth. You just bullshit the whole goddamn time. And now we've hired people that all they do is defend the team rather than actually engage in the analytic problems that we have. So it's all social personal. That's why I have to turn off the debates. I can't even take it anymore because they're so obvious. If you have my lens, it's so obvious that you're just a corrupted human being. All you are is just a narrating bullshitter across some other predetermined motive. If you want to be that way, fine, but that's not the way to be, okay? At least as far as my value system. So ultimately, it says the whole, it opens up a whole set of, well, yeah, why am I given the reasons that I'm giving, all right? And what it tells you is actually, yeah, you think that you're doing it, but actually by design, there's a little set point that says, develop socially acceptable rules based on your calculation and start generating narrative, all right? And quite frankly, what you'll find is just people are engaged in mindless BS justification all the damn time. And that's painful. You know? And you'll find yourself doing it. I used to refer to myself as a verbal, okay? And then encourage other people. And so what it does, it will be humbling a bit, okay? Because once you actually see it, if you're not practiced, when you first see it, you're like, when I came in and realized, oh my God, the traffic was immediately basically a reflex of justification that I engaged in. And then I saw myself doing it all the time. It's a little humbling. So, yep, it's everywhere. Like I just justified why we can engage in justification analyses.
I'm going to ask one more question and then I'm going to switch to that. Are there synonyms here to justification, like is storytelling or beliefs? Like, could you help us with why the word justification and maybe how is it different than these other things we'll say, oh, a human's a storytelling person, a human's a...
Yeah. Well, just, that's a good question. I guess what I would say is it's just the nexus point of so many different things. It sort of is like, I fell into it and it does this, it does this, it does this. The issue is that it's the intersection of proposition and legitimizing. It's propositional legitimizing. So what it does is it connects the language system, okay, and its medium, and then it connects it to is, ought to do, and influence and investment. So it makes it alive. So and it is that intersection. And then you can use that intersection, with practice. Again, this is unbelievably, I landed on this idea, it took decades for me to flesh it out. So really, don't try to grok it all at once, okay? The issue basically is, plant the seed of justification, you know, and then just start using it. And it's like, well, what is it and where and how? How do I apply that? Okay. And now it's like, oh, okay, there's analytic justification where I'm actually asking truth-based claims. There's social and personal dynamics. Well, it's a private, narrator, personal. Oh, okay, so there's a social dynamic. What did I find myself wanting to say this? Well, there's a social personal dynamic. If we're all getting together in a group, now we have to decide, hey, are we going to meet? What's the identity of us? Oh, that's a social dynamic. Is there a truth claim that's on the table? That's an analytic dynamic. And then you start getting into that, and the whole thing is like an onion, and it layers itself. So what I'll say is let it grow. Don't try to reduce it, and just be with it, and you'll see it will just morph and move, but it doesn't lose its coherence. It actually just grows in it. At least that's my experience.
Could you give me and explain it like in 5 version of what you just said? I don't think I quite understood. And then.
Yeah, that wasn't a 5-year-old version. Okay, so a couple of, I'll do it this way. So your propositional system is trying to get a handle on it right now. Okay. All right, so that's a good thing to note. All right, so there's a propositional sense-making system trying to get a handle on, and it's sort of both so broad that it gets slippery. It's like, where's the tree? Where's the forest? Okay, so then we could just say, oh, that's what your propositional system is doing. All right. So the other thing that I'll say is most of the time, your propositional system is just tracking systems of justification. All right, that's what mostly it's doing. So an everyday conversation. Hey, dear, can you go get me that glass of milk? I forgot it. Oh, notice I said I forgot it, which was implied, but it then says, actually, I'm taking responsibility. I said I forgot. Okay. And now, why am I saying I forgot? Well, because I'm actually asking you to spend money. If I just said, hey, dear, go get the milk, guess what she would have said? Fuck you, if I'm talking about my wife. Okay, it's like, what the hell? You go get the goddamn milk, right? But if I say I forgot it, then what does that do? It basically says I'll acknowledge that I was foolish, I should have been gotten it there. You'll see all the time that you'll give disclaimers, okay? As you give accounts, you're like, well, hey, this may come across as a little insensitive. Trigger warning, okay? What's that? Well, that's a disclaimer, gives me safe space so I can then say something that would potentially be offensive. Well, that creates a justification dynamic. So anyway, the point of Islanden is actually, it's a somewhat difficult question to answer because of its ubiquity and depth. It's just sort of like, yep. It's basically don't try to reduce it to a thing. Just let yourself recognize that it's an ocean.
So it's like question answer dynamics are what get you into this, and then it's trying to fit in socially, but then also at the level of truth and so on, that then is how this carries itself out. Is that?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, so I built the whole unified theory of knowledge around it, okay? So that because it opened up so many damn questions that I then had to resolve, all right? That's another way. So, if I had an endless number of sense-making things, like one of the things we're not talking about at all is the influence matrix, all right? In fact, I just got off the phone with Jordan Hall because I was like, Jordan, when you get into, you and Daniel Schmachtenberger are getting into the concept of influence, be very aware that that's a very complicated concept you have to deconstruct, okay? Like, for example, there's power influence, there's love influence, there's freedom dynamics around influence. Most important is the distinction between relational value and influence and social influence at a pragmatic level. Especially if you start to get into game B dynamics, because game A is all about instrumental social influence, and really there's core relational value dynamics about aligning those. I know I'm not maybe making a lot of sense here, but the bottom line is that, yeah, it's a massive amounts of layering, okay? And then you have to get into the layering. Well, that's the social dynamics. Well, what are the personal versus social dynamics? And then what's the socio-historical dynamics and so forth, okay? So, and in fact, the entire unified theory is essentially an encapsulation around, once I opened up unlocked the key of justification, and then just like, boom, it's like, it's fucking everywhere.
Wow, you see the water.
All of a sudden I saw the water, right? And it was very deep and very broad. And it took me lots of different places, like a damn garden.
Let's go to some of the questions that are in the chat.
Perfect.
I'm going to start with Fred, and then after that, Andy. So Fred, if you want to ask your question. You're muted, Fred. Yeah, it looks like.
Oh, okay. I'm here. Thank you.
Yes.
I'm just trying to find my question again. First of all, Greg, thanks for taking time to explain your theory and all the epiphanies that led you to it. And engines, you saw the water. The fish saw the water. And I certainly don't claim to understand the breadth of what you're presenting. But a couple questions about, well, first of all, are you curious if you have a theory of positive psychology or human flourishing? Well, that's good enough. And
I'm sorry, did you ask what about positive psychology and flourishing?
do you have a, do you have a theory of positive psychology or human flourishing?
Yes. I mean, the seventh branch on the tree back there, that's the nested model of well-being. In fact, I critique positive psychology because they are basically, unfortunately, they just follow mainstream academic psychology, which is basically an empirical discipline. And as such, they basically empirically carve up virtue in the positive domains, which is very useful. But if you just carve up empirical constructs, you basically have what's called the sandcastle problem, meaning they're going to build lots of different super cool ideographic or research-driven concepts, like, oh, growth mindset, or oh, character virtue, or all these kinds of notions, or subjective well-being. The question is, though, how do they interrelate? What values how do we put this together? How do we put it together with the dark side of human experience and a holistic view? So I'm a really big fan that, clinical and empirical psychology move from the dark side into the positive. That's good. Unfortunately, Martin Seligman's version of positive psychology is, in my opinion, a decent start, but unbelievably shallow and not very philosophically sophisticated.
So what do you need to add back in? I mean, I'm with you. People who do psychotherapy with for folks who are unhappy, trauma survivors, et cetera, is unbelievably important. But I would say that our psychology looks like it's missing all these other dimensions. It has no normative aspect in the way clinical psychology is practiced.
Totally.
So what are the dimensions that you feel need to be added to Seligman's, say, or Barbara Fredrickson, or pick them?
Yeah, no, it's not so much a dimension. It's really the way in which they are put together so that you create a whole understanding. So if you take the question fundamentally then is so Seligman tries to get to this. He gets to what's called PERMA, okay, and which is basically sort of a domain of sort of positive emotion. He gets into relationships. He gets into achievement. I can't remember all. Anyway, PERMA is an acronym for the big domains that he identifies. So that if you fill these in, then you have some more eudaimonic, which is an Aristotelian notion of sort of the ultimate good life. So what you see happens in positive psychology is that the field splits between the empiricists that do subjective well-being, at least at the well-being level, versus the more functionalists that do and philosophically sophisticated that do Aristotelian optimal functioning. So the reason I built the nested model is to understand how to put together the empirical frames of reference with the more value-laden optimal functional frames of reference into a holistic model of what well-being is that's coherent and appreciates both the science side and the value-laden side, okay? So actually it turns out to be pretty simple at one level, in the sense that actually the proper model of well-being, according to this, is that it starts with a first-person experience, uses the empirical analysis of subjective well-being for positive and affective, negative affect, general narrative, which is general life satisfaction, specific domain narrative, which is, are you happy with your relationships, happy with your job, happy with finances? Then you drop that into a psychological functioning and organismic functioning, physiology, as what a medical doctor would do. Then you place that individual in both the material and social environment, and you see harmony. To the extent that there's harmony, and to the extent, or there's suffering, gives you an illness, health dimension. But ultimately, you have to then encapsulate that in the ideology and values of the evaluator. Okay, you have to recognize that actually, if you're going to make a claim about well-being, all right, you have to. So, for example, if I identify somebody, let's say, oh, they're really healthy physically, they're climbing up in their job, they're happy with their family, they're doing what they can, and I tell you, oh, by the way, it's 1942, and they are leading Auschwitz. Okay. If I tell you that as opposed to some other individual, then most people say, I don't know, the well-being of the Auschwitz leader bugs me a little bit. And the reason is because ultimately, when we start to think about well-being, it's a value-laden concept, so we actually want to tie it back to our ethical values and worldview. So anyway, positive psychology is super important, but like the rest of psychology, it's a fragmented nightmare at the level of its coherence, and it needs to be woven together. So once we can then have a coherent model, then we can actually generate and provide people the wisdom that it affords, but in a frame of understanding that they can actually have, rather than the fragmented particulate frame that actually both exists and then it's translated by.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. It's great.
Andy, and then after that, Roy.
Greg, I love justification systems theory to explain the concept of the closet Trump voter. So there's clearly a non-coherence between the public self, the private self, and the justification that goes on when you publicly say or say to yourself that morally abhorrent or whatever, I hate the guy, and yet you vote for him.
Yep.
Question is, what has changed besides proliferation of media in the last 50 years that makes, in your opinion, justification systems different now than 50 years ago?
Great question. That's a wonderful question. I think it warrants a lot of study. Here's my basic answer, is that you're basically getting the crest of modernity in the 1960s, okay? And what I mean by the crest of modernity, I mean that you come off of World War II, you then, especially like in the United States, you then get an establishment of the institutions, the understanding, the roles and functions of what individuals are doing, and essentially the knowledge systems are adequate to give people a sense of security, clarity, and understanding, okay? So in other words, basically it's up to the task. Now, what you start to see in the 1960s is, there has been these horrible World War I, World War II, and these deviations, and we have these serious concerns, and with Nazism, we see, oh my God, there is some profound problem with modernity and white male domination and colonialism. And so you see social justice movements, you see starting to critique continental philosophers starting to critique the depth and truth claims, transcendental truth claims. But really in the 1960s and 70s, although there's a lot of social unrest, obviously 68, things like that. But ultimately, people are like, oh yeah, we have enough sense making relative to the information ecology, relative to the change, relative to what's happening to be good enough. We feel like we're on progress and we're actually sane and okay. We trust the broadcasting functions and the structures seem to be, so that we have faith in the institutions, okay? And then basically the world is changing so fast at the level of technology, at the level of polluting the information ecology, digital tips. Okay, we hook ourselves up into an enormous number of different things, and then we start facing more and more challenging. So the size of the actual complexity of the information ecology, the rapidity of change that's happening, the availability of different communication networks, okay, essentially in a period of a couple decades completely outstrips the old paradigm's capacity for regulation, sense-making, and control, okay? So that overall, then now the rules of the game, and this is the shorthand for this is digital, okay? From the vantage point of the tree of knowledge, when you get the emergence of a novel information processing communication system, okay, like gene cells, okay, genes process store information, the cell computes information and then engages in communication with other cells. The nervous system processes information, animals communicate, and then people talk, process symbolic information, and communicate. Well, cells are totally different than chemistry. Animals are totally different than plants. People are totally different than animals. Each one of those is a totally different dimension of complexity as a function of information processing communication. So when I found the tree of knowledge, I knew the 21st century was going to be a shit show, okay? About 6 months after I discovered, 6 weeks, because I knew that we had laid down the internet, we had developed artificial intelligence, we were building a communication system that was going to open up a set of possibilities that was just not going to be able to be contained in the old institutional system. And that's the short answer is that I think that we have access to information, perspective, and ways of being that our knowledge systems are not, they're not good justification systems for it, and they're not up to the task. These are the things that ground our institutions. So everybody's losing trust in the institutions. Everyone's looking around going, there's something deeply wrong and unsustainable about the structure, because the change factor is grossly outstripping the constraint capacity during all sorts of chaos. Hopefully that chaos will be realized into opportunity. We'll find new equilibrating. I talk about the fifth joint point, new equilibrating structures that then allow us to get settled and then, you know, find a way to the 21st century that's a lot saner than the current state of affairs.
So it was less complex 50 years ago to form heuristics. How were tribes formed differently? How, you know, let's say if you were Protestant Reformation time and you didn't want to believe the only hierarchy, the Catholic Church or something, there was less complexity with knowledge, but it was so monopolized that weren't you still afraid then to?
Yeah, of course, but the broadcasting function of the church is just so strong; it can stay for 500 years. You know, right? Because in other words, so you're a closet atheist, right? And you might, of course, you might loathe it. You hate the freedom. Listen, I'm glad I don't live in. For somebody hung in about 5 seconds, right? In relationship to the time, right? There's no opportunity. The system, the church controls the justification and institutional infrastructure so unbelievably tightly, and the information capacities is so unbelievably limited that it can just regulate. So that if it then has spies out everywhere, and if you start doing heresy like atheism, we're going to find you and we're going to root you out. And of course, there's a subset of Jews that they have to hang around and lend money, you know. But basically, the entire infrastructure of the polis, the government, everybody is online with a particular system of justification. So it has massive control, and the information technologies that are available. I mean, most people can't even read. Okay, so it's only narrative. So how do you get your message out? How would you know, right? If three villages over, there's another atheist, right? Okay, you would never know. But now, obviously, on the internet, you know, all you need to do is just to do a Google search, and I can instantaneously, out of 7 billion people, or however many people are actually on the internet, I can instantaneously do a search and find people that have fetishes for high-heeled shoes or whatever it would be, right? So the information ecology and the availability of lines of communication, the internet, I mean, writing changed it dramatically, okay? Telephone changed it. All of those mediums. Marshall McLuhan's a great theorist. He talks about how the mediums shape us and totally change the patterns of behavioral investment that we have. Well, the argument is that digital is changing us like no other system. It makes writing look like a little drop in the bucket. So digital completely transforms the information network. And then that opens up all sorts of adjacent possibilities. The structure is not built for, and now everyone's sort of, well, what has legitimacy? What can we trust? Is this actually going to hold together?
How has the positive side of this structure influenced things that one would consider now to be second order gain B? So let's use two examples. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, smoking in restaurants had no momentum to be banned. Legalizing pot, gay marriage.
Right.
why did these things change so quickly over the course of a 10-year time period? And how does that differ and relate to media compared to 50 years ago?
Yeah, no, it's great. Well, first off, what you're seeing is over the last 50 years, you're seeing the building of the postmodern critique, okay? And the postmodern sensibility, which is challenging traditionalist authority, okay, in certain regards, all right? So you have that mentality is gaining wave so that the millennials are not looking at their elders going, gosh, you guys knew everything, man, thanks so much. It's like, no, you guys are totally clueless, okay? And they have a totally different frame of reference for justice, for what's value, for what's appropriate, and they're not shy about it, all right? And that wave of challenging the authority of tradition has been building, okay? And part of it is made accessible, and in many ways a good way. I mean, the old white male tradition, believe me, thank God that's coming down. And we're opening up all sorts of different lines of diversity. People can be much freer to be themselves. The opportunities are unbelievably tremendous. And you know, there's a lot of truth to see Pinker's enlightenment now in relationship to the general trajectory of reason and humanism, giving people more and more opportunities. I think there's a lot of downsides too, and I think the trajectory is bad unless we change our fundamental understanding of human nature. We're on a dangerous path. I believe, like Schmachtenberger and Hall talk about, this is self-terminating if we don't change the fundamental structure. So, but what I've been amazed at connecting with all the seers is the number of people that are seeing this same mountain from different perspectives, and the emergence of things like Peter Lindbergh and the steward of the Stoa, and bringing people together to think differently and realize to get outside the box. Now, I'm a traditional academic. I've been inside the academy my whole life. I came from, you know, two parents who are professors and then into a professorship. But why am I here? Because the damn academy is stuck in its old modes of being. I get super frustrated. I'm like, listen, people, wake up. It's time for an upgrade in your operating system. You guys are trapped in the past. 50 years ago is like 500 years ago now. And we all need to be waking up, because the entire educational system, the entire knowledge system, and, you know, most of my colleagues are, well, I've got to get this randomized controlled trial paper out, and it showed a little bit of difference, and I hope it will get through peer review. I'm like, that is so done. That's like, sorry, that is not going to cut the mustard. We're talking about a fundamental shift. At least that's where I am. And Rob Scott, I know, would appreciate that comment. A fundamental shift in our identities is what I believe we need to engage in. So that's my thinking in relation.
We got about 6 minutes left. Roy, do you think you want to ask your question, and maybe 2 minutes just to close up?
Sure. Thank you, Greg, for your talk. I'm a slow talker, so I find a fast talker floods me quite easily. So I'm hoping you can keep it fairly simple for me. I'll try to speed up my question.
No worries.
I've been in the construction industry. I noticed an erosion of trust in that industry for 4 decades. 6 years ago, I began the transition to alternative dispute resolution. And I now act as a neutral on construction disputes.
Okay.
So the acronym ADR, I hadn't even heard of until I made that transition. I get a lot of value out of the psychology and meaning crisis information. I'm hoping you could give me a good reference for further research that would integrate your world with my world of dispute resolution in construction.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for that, Roy. I appreciate that. I'm a clinician, and so I've done a lot of marriage therapy, and of course work with people managing being stuck in conflict with themselves, with their past, with their future, with their wives. So it's definitely close to my heart, and finding pathways of effective remediation and mediation are absolutely central to some of the work. I'll point you to my homepage, Unified Theory of Knowledge, and it's got 8 key ideas on it. when people are asking me, you know, kind of, well, how do I apply your system in a way that helps me, especially when people are in conflict? The thing that I try to help folks do, what I offer them, is a frame for an integrative approach to psychological mindfulness. Psychological mindfulness is the process by which we enter into our space and allow ourselves to become aware and attuned to what is happening, as opposed to mindlessness, right? Which is when we're just defensive and reacting. So we want, when we're dealing with individuals that are actually at least open then to the process by which they would then find a more adaptive resolution if they're in conflict. We try to, at what's called a stage of change level, we want to get them contemplating about ways in which they would be different. Okay. And then invite them to be open to the possibility of that difference. And then if you get that and you get some commitment to that, then the question is, well how would you then cultivate that attitude? And generally what you want to try to do is you want to foster levels of awareness, acceptance, and then change in various parties, okay? And realize the difference between sort of ego commitments to maladaptive patterns versus openness to potential adaptive valued pathways. And how do you do that? Well, the shorthand of what I offer is what thing called CALM, okay, which is an acronym. First, it's like, hey, let's get calm. Let's recognize that when we get pissed off, we drop into defensive mindsets. It's either attack, we freeze or flight, or we fawn and apologize, and then we resent it later. These are classic stances in and we want to basically, we want to acknowledge those, and we understand where they come from, our body and our emotion. We also realize that they're actually short-term emotional responses that are very valuable in orienting us, but rarely valuable in the impulses that they orient us towards, okay, at least in the short term. So we then want to listen to them and listen to their appraisal, listen to your heart, and then open up an attitude, both intrapsychically and interpersonally, that fosters curiosity, okay? So curiosity, yes, I see somebody talking about restorative justice here. That's beautiful too. That's a nice, helpful way of thinking about there are lots of different ways to peace and connection. But anyway, curiosity first orients individuals to a more mindful state that then adopts a position where you can be wondering about oneself and one's other. Where does this come from? What's really going on? What's the salient issue, and what's the deeper issues perhaps? Then there's issues of acceptance. This is a capacity to recognize that actually, yeah, life sucks sometimes, you get hurt. How can you sit with what is, with distress tolerance, with clarity? Okay. Then L stands for loving compassion. That's an attitude of just basic dignity towards others, and that you hope that they aren't suffering. This is, again, identity towards self and other. And then M refers to a motivated toward valued states of being in the short and long term. So if I'm in negotiation, what is the moment? What do I hope in relationship to the end of this negotiation? And what is my long-term view, ultimately all the way up to what might be called eulogy values, which is what kind of person do I want to be, and what kind of ancestor do I want to be? So that then places it on the context of time. So what that basically is that tries to create the kind of arena that enables individuals to be able to come together who have been wounded, who've been traumatized, who are bitter with each other, who have real disputes, but at least it soothes and orients towards adaptive outcomes. And it identifies the underlying emotional triggers and how to hold them, how to honor them, but also not how to be held hijacked, limbic hijack, people will say about in relationships.
Greg, it's 3:30 now. Would you have any time afterwards, if we were to end the session, just to hang out with a couple of us?
Yeah, sure. If I'm totally open to that.
Okay.
So, yep, I've got certainly till 4. So if people want to hang, I don't know if do we need to get off the Stoa?
So let's just quickly formally close. So the recording can be done. To plug an event, there's an event later today at 8 p.m. Eastern by Justin Weinberg. It's called Disagreeing Well. And The summary is, while disagreement is often treated as a problem, Weinberg thinks there's some overlooked upsides to it. He'll talk about the value of disagreement, obstacles to disagreeing well, and how we might better get along with those whom we disagree. So pretty good to show up on the same day as Gregg's justification systems.
Amen. Amen.
Gregg, any closing thoughts and any kind of foreshadowing for what next week is?
You know, I guess the closing thought is just learning how to observe your justification systems, realizing that they're not reality. They are a very important aspect of who we are, but being able to shift your perspective on them, see them in other people, recognize the dynamics. I believe that's a very valuable thing. So that's why I'm happy to share.
And next week, is there a theme to the session?
Yeah, so next week we will kind of come in with a slightly different angle. We'll talk about the problem of psychology. We'll need to understand what that is from my vantage point. Then what we'll do is we get to open up and do a conversation with a special guest, Zach Stein, who talked about his own meta-psychology. And then we'll have some iterative dialogue between his version and experience of the field of psychology, why it led him to his view, what my view is, and you know how to see them complementary. Somebody asked a question about how those two things relate. I can't remember who, but somebody did, and it led to a lot of good discussion.
That's going to be really exciting. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Thanks, Gregg. Have a great day.
All right.
And